welcome to Modern Animism, a holistic spiritual path. I'm your host, Laura Giles. Thanks for tuning in. We have a special guest today, Katherine Moore. She's a researcher on the Iron Age, Celtic mythology, and religion and gender in the Iron Age Britain, who bases her Celtic Reconstructionist Druid spiritual practices on her research. And that's quite a mouthful. I think you'll find she has a lot to say that's really interesting, and it may help to give you some things to think about in your own spiritual path. So let's get started by giving gratitude and creating sacred space. I acknowledge and thank the element of earth for the food, home, stability, strong foundation, and the community that sustains us all. I acknowledge and thank the element of air for inspiring us with ideas and taking our words to our ancestors. And I acknowledge and thank the element of fire for giving us the sun to keep us warm and to help the plants grow, for giving us the power to create change and a sense of responsibility to balance that out. And I acknowledge the element of water and thank you for sustaining our lives and reminding us to go with the flow. I acknowledge and thank our loving, helping ancestors from the human, plant, animal, and mineral kingdoms. And I thank all of you for the help that we receive that is seen and unseen. I thank our listening community that continues to grow. I deeply appreciate those who have been with us since the beginning, as well as those who drop in now and then, and the ones that are new right now. And if any of our shows inspire or help you, please consider donating to help sustain us. And you can do that on our website at www.pansociety.net or from the Podbean app if you're listening from there. And if money is an issue, you can also help by liking, commenting, and sharing our posts on social media. This helps our stats so that we get better ranking in social media and we can be more easily found. So it helps us to grow. So if you benefit at all, I ask that you return that energy in some form of support to honor the spirit of reciprocity. So welcome, Katherine Moore. Can you share your ethnic and spiritual background with us?
Well, my ethnic background is probably like a lot of people living in Britain, fairly mixed. So my mum's half of the family are Welsh. Pretty much all we know is they were miners in South Wales as far back as records go. My dad's side is a little bit more mixed. We've got some English, got some Scottish and Irish, and some Italian. But sort of culturally, I grew up with a mix of English and Welsh because I live right by the border. And spiritually, my background is I grew up in a Christian household, so they were Church of England, which generally is very relaxed. And I grew up among very, very relaxed parents, and I sort of converted to what I do now, Celtic Reconstructionist Druidry, about a year and a half ago. It was before Cullen Have or Beltane. So yeah, that sort of time period. But my background within Christianity before that, like I say, was very liberal, and I wasn't from a strict background at all. And my family haven't accepted my conversion sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So how does one become a druid?
Well, I suppose you have there are different schools of druidry, and I suppose different people would say different things. I would say that, because the sort of stuff that I do is based on trying to reconstruct Iron Age practices, and within the Iron Age, the druids were a priestly class, and from our sources, we think it would have taken at least 10 years for you to become a druid. You would have learned law and both law, L-O-R-E, and L-A-W, because they were sort of lawmakers and law arbiters. But so to do it now, I think I sort of call I do druidry because I haven't got a better word for it, I suppose. But I would say that it's a continual sort of practice. It's engagement with written sources, so it's written sources such as mythology, and practical things such as making offerings and trying to connect with practical tools, I suppose. So that's how I would do it. I would say that my process is still ongoing and is likely to be ongoing for a very long time. I don't think it's a set thing Druid and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, it's a continual building up
Mm-hmm.
of your practice.
So how is that different from Wicca or paganism?
Okay, so what I would do, Celtic Reconstructionists in particular are generally viewed as very strict, I suppose, because it's like I don't incorporate anything into my practice that I know comes from other sources, so it comes from a later period, or even some things that might have been used but we're not certain of. So with things like, paganism I view as an umbrella term. So it can include Druidry, it can include Wicca, it can include, many different things.
Mm-hmm.
So with Wicca, the issue is that Wicca came about in the 1920s, and it purports to be essentially old teachings of witchcraft and so on that have been passed down. And the issue is, if you look into the sources, is that the sources can be very sparse, and they're based on witchcraft trials that aren't known for necessarily being accurate. I basically, when I wanted to convert to paganism, I was basically like, what, like a lot of people, I think, what is best fit for me? What is important to me? And I'm lucky that I have some very good friends who are very like me in terms of their academic understandings of religion. And I have a friend who's very involved in the sort of, I suppose, Norse understandings of paganism, but he's also very academic and looks at it through that light. And so, really, for me, being Wiccan wasn't enough. I wanted something that was more, because I come from a background, my degree, my BA is in theology, Christian theology, but I'm sort of like, I want to have definitive reasons for why I practice something. It's not enough for me to sort of say, to have a more faith-based approach, I suppose, to sort of say, oh, well, this feels right, so therefore it's valid. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, it's just for me, that wasn't what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be, I suppose that would be the difference for me between Wiccanism and certainly what I do is it's just more, what I do is more prescriptive, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes.
So what does this mean? How does it show up in your day-to-day life? Or does it?
My day-to-day life, usually at the moment what I'm doing is, at the moment working on my thesis. So I'm critically engaging with a lot of material that I use really as a religious basis. So it's continually sort of challenging me and making me question, how do I interpret this, but how do I interpret something in a religious context as opposed to my writing, my thesis is obviously analysis, and I analyse like mythological tropes and sociological aspects, things like that. But so if, for instance, we've just had Gwyl Awst or Nasa, which honours Lug or Heythrop in Welsh literature, and so before that I gave an offering in pretty much what we can determine with the way that an Iron Age Druid would have done it, through breaking and placing into water, and also looking at the mythological material, so looking at Lleo is present within the fourth branch of the Mabinogion, and just reading his tale and trying to think sort of critically about what's going on in the tale. It's like a lot of mythology, particularly Celtic mythology, it's very weird. It's very you learn this stuff and it's just, we have this idea of mythology being this very serious thing. Mythology is like, well, it's the same way that people can read the Bible, which is also sort of wrong, in that it's a very very serious view of it, and it sometimes it's not at all. It's not. We like some people sort of like to make out that they're very fae sort of gods and very mysterious sorts of thing. And actually, there's a lot of weird stuff you've got to try and get your head around. And I don't really have the answers for how to do that, but you sort of just have to acknowledge it, I suppose.
So what made you go with Iron Age? I mean, out of any age you could pick, why that?
Well, it's really the oldest you can really go. You can try to understand some forms of Neolithic religion, but it's very difficult to do. The Iron Age, we sort of have the best sources available, but they're not perfect because a lot of them are written by Romans who A, don't know what they're talking about, and B, are prejudiced. But basically, I wanted to give that because I'm fascinated by the Iron Age. It's apart from sort of mythology, it's my main area of study, so I absolutely find it fascinating. And it's also the oldest that we can sort of go culturally. So the cultural makeup of Wales is, and within other countries, of course, is markedly distinct from Anglo-Saxon culture in England, and it stems from Brythonic culture, which is pre-Roman culture. Some of it is mixed in with Roman stuff, so you have to be a bit careful. But so that's really why I wanted to go for it. It felt the most valid for my sort of striving for connection with my Welsh side of my family, and particularly because I'm now living in Wales. It felt like the thing I wanted to pursue the most, I suppose.
Okay, so it was personal and meaningful?
Yes, yeah. I think any sort of thing has to be. And that's why I sort of, it wasn't so, I think it's like a lot of things. It's less that I chose it and that it chose me.
Okay.
And once I found out about it when I was researching different forms of, it was like I was, exploring different forms of sort of paganism, and then within that I sort of came across Druidry. So I was sort of like, okay, this feels, suitably obscure and difficult to work with. And then I found Celtic Reconstructionism, which was the ultimate form of it, and I thought, of course I have to go with this because I can't make life easy for myself at all. I just always have to do that. So yeah, it sort of found me out. Like, yeah, this is what you have to do. And I was like, oh, great, yeah, it is. So you just have to go with it.
Okay. And you are a researcher of mythological Celtic women as well. Is that something, was that just a function of you were interested in that as too?
Yeah, so it's, it's a mixture of things. So my thesis is on basically the portrayal of women within Celtic mythology and Iron Age women within written sources. And they're always, of course, the sources are written by men. So it's basically an analysis of that. And this stems from, I did my BA dissertation in the portrayal of women within Luke's Gospel. So I sort of had a background within that, and my personal interests as a woman, I suppose, and the academia around Celtic women is really fascinating. And actually, you're looking at trying to understand individuals within, like, Iron Age society, or a bit society a little bit later than that. We actually have the best. We have more sources for women than we do for men, so it's actually more fruitful. So that's really why I was drawn to it, both a mixture of my previous academic research and just people I was sort of, what you're drawn to when I've been doing my MA. And I'm very lucky that my supervisor for my thesis is an extremely renowned folklorist, and she has done a lot of work on women and mythology, essentially. So I was able to really get in depth with her.
Nice.
Certain things, yeah.
So is there anything particularly interesting that popped out that like the average person wouldn't know about mythological Celtic women?
I suppose the biggest thing that I love and that always strikes me is how vocal they are. If you look at, particularly I look at Rhiannon, Queen Rhiannon, who's in the first and third branches of the Mabinogion. She is incredibly sassy, particularly with her love interest and later husband, Quick. And he does things. Quick is, sweet but an idiot, and he's constantly doing things. He puts his foot in things, and she has to sort it out. And there are bits where she just outright tells him off and just says, there's a bit where he's silent. He does something really stupid. She says something along the lines of, "Yeah, you stay silent. You should never have spoken, opened your mouth in the first place." And so they have this really interesting dynamic, which then becomes inverted later on in the tale, but it's a different thing. But and constantly when you look at the Iron Age women as well, the Romans were really threatened by powerful women, because in their society, women aren't vocal; they're kept away in the house. Whereas in Celtic Iron Age society, they're very much part of public life. And the women that they talk about in the written sources are Queen Cartamandua, who's queen of the Brigantes, who are up in the north, and Boudica, obviously, famous. And the thing about both of them is they are so outspoken, and the Romans keep trying to do, particularly to Boudica, they keep trying to shut her up, and she just doesn't. She keeps fighting back. And I think that's a great thing about the mythological women, but also the Iron Age women, is how vocal they are and how, I think, human that makes them. It's actually much easier for us to see ourselves within these women. We have this idea that people from the past and so on were so different from us, and people in the mythology are just so understandable. But if you really look at it and try to understand it on a personal level, which is what my research is about, then I think you really can, and I really love that about them. You don't have even people like, so in the Irish mythology you have, I'm going to Deirdre, I think for her name in a second, and she is effectively a sex slave. She is marked out, even when she's still in the womb. King Conqueror puts his hand on her mother's stomach and is sort of like, a bard basically says that she's going to grow up to be this really beautiful woman, and he's like, as soon as she's born, I want her isolated so that when she's old enough, I can have her. So it's really disgusting, and she, it's really like, oh my god, it's horrible, and it's framed as such by the story. But she meets this man, Neusha, and she falls in love with him, and she's like, he's sort of like, oh, I don't know if I want to go on with you, and she sort of effectively, she seems to sort of put some sort of spell on him and bind him to her, and she's sort of like, no, we're gonna go off, we're gonna fall in love, and that's what they do. And so even someone like that, who within other traditions, particularly in Anglo-Saxon traditions, the women, they never speak, they never do anything, they're always passive, and some characters like Branwen are passive within the mythology, but a lot of them are also even people who are in these very fixed circumstances, who are, locked into what seem to be, effectively, chattel slavery, break free from it and are vocal and assert their own autonomy, I suppose. So that's what I find fascinating about Celtic women, and that I always go back to. That's why I love researching them. Yeah.
So why do you suppose, we're sitting here talking about these stories in mythology, and Wales has a festival for that.
Yeah.
And you don't really see that in other places. Why do you suppose that the Welsh still honor their storytellers?
Well, I think that you have to really understand the history of Wales, and the history, particularly in Wales, but in other countries as well, that of oppression, Anglo-Saxon oppression, which is unfortunately still a feature of our daily life, the way in which Wales resources are siphoned off to England and things like that. And which is amazing and fascinating. But the things like the Eisteddfod, which is what you're talking about, is really a result of tireless work from people who value the language. The Welsh language came so incredibly close to dying out, and it's really only resurging in the last 20 years. So things like the Eisteddfod were ancient festivals from the early medieval period. Bardic tradition obviously goes back way longer than that, way into probably the Neolithic. We've always had storytellers, and part of why the Eisteddfod has come back, and of course it's very important to say that this is a Welsh language festival, and that it's done and conducted in the Welsh language, is that it's preserving sort of cultural traditions. And I think that that's a really important aspect of Welsh culture, is that in Wales there's a thing of you're incredibly proud to be Welsh and to be part of the culture, and it really doesn't matter where you come from. That it's sort of a celebration of everything we want Wales to be. And through something like the Eisteddfod, it's really about connection with ancient custom, but at the same time it's also allowing other cultural influences in. And the good thing about when you have a culture that is so distinct and that has such long tradition, is that you can be comfortable with inviting other people along, sort of saying, so we have, where I live in Cardiff, I live by the bay, and just down the road we have probably the area in Cardiff that has the biggest amount of ethnically diverse people. So we've got a big Muslim population, we've got people from this big Hindu population, and it just obviously there are, like in any place, there can be people who are racist and so on, but generally there's this view of you come, particularly within the independence movement, is that this idea of Wales as a sanctuary, and that if you want to come to Wales and build a better life, that you're sort of integrated and that your culture is sort of accepted. And it's this constant thing of you can't be stagnant within your culture, you've got to keep moving. And Wales is continually sort of, with the Welsh language and the resurgence of that, it's the continually making the media. There's a surge in Welsh music, for example, and not just, I listen to pretty much exclusively folk music, but not just folk music, rock music and so on. And so it just keeps going, and I think that is a testament to things like putting money into teaching people Welsh. One of the things that I'm most ashamed of is the fact that I can only speak a tiny bit of Welsh, and I want to learn more. And but children growing up here, they learn it and just literally beaten out of my grandparents. They didn't speak Welsh, and so therefore my mum didn't speak Welsh, so therefore I can't speak Welsh. And it's about fixing those generational trauma, essentially.
Yeah. So you call yourself ethnically Welsh or ethnic Welsh, and I have Welsh ancestors, but I was reared here in the USA, and I didn't know any of them. They came to the USA in the 1830s, which obviously that's way before my time. So in your opinion, what's the difference between someone who's ethnically Welsh and someone with Welsh ancestry, as far as like religion goes, or their ability to claim that?
Sure. Well, I think, to be honest, like I said before, particularly for me, but also generally within movements in Wales, is it's really not important what your ancestry is. I mean, my sort of culture is intensely personal in that it was only a couple of generations ago that that the language was beaten out of us and so on. But really, anyone coming to Wales is, and wanting to engage and wanting to to understand the culture is, it's not like you can only access this if you are, I don't know, a certain amount of, blood percentages and so on. It all just seems a bit, to be honest, it seems a bit sort of like Nazi to me to be so prescriptive about something like that. I think it's about, people come here and they want to know about Wales and they want to learn the language, and it's just like, we want to teach people, we want people to be engaged, and we want people to feel welcome. My partner is originally, he's from Kent, but, which is Eastern England, but his family are Nepalese, so ethnically he's Nepalese, but I would say he's more English than I am, because of the way in which he interacts with English culture, and he's moved to Wales, obviously, with me, so he's been here for about a year, and he's sort of like, oh, I don't know about, whether I can claim to be Welsh and so on. I'm like, you live here, you interact with people, the issue is that we do have people from England who move, they retire into Wales, and they are very critical of Welsh culture, and they don't like the language, and all that sort of thing, and that, it's this feeling of some people in England feel that Wales is an extension of England, and that they can just sort of, property prices are cheaper here, and so you can just buy a second home, and that adds to Wales' problems in terms of lack of housing, lack of affordable housing, people live here, things like that. So I really don't think that you need to be too worried about being, ethnically, Welsh or, whatever. I mean, when you go back far enough, I don't know in my Welsh ancestry whether there might be some Viking, there might be some Roman, so and ultimately, if you go back far enough, we all come from Africa, which,
right.
So I think that that of course does not say that there aren't, issues with race and so on today and how it's been constructed, but I feel like just going by things like that is sort of unhelpful. I would say that in terms of who can claim Welshness, I don't think it's really one person's. No one person can determine that. I think the only things you need to do are just respect the culture and to try to understand it. And so, in terms of claiming it, I think it is just, a sense of appreciation and a sense of understanding Wales today as well, and the understanding of things like the independence movement and poverty in Wales and, all these sorts of things. So, I certainly don't think that I can sit here and, determine who can claim things as for them and not in terms of Welshness. Like, I think it would be stupid for me to do that and insulting for me to do it, possibly.
Okay. So how does the blood fit in? How does ancestor reverence fit in? Is this part of your Druid practice?
Yes. So ancestor sort of worship and so on is obviously integral to many different areas of sort of folk magic and paganism of different strands. It's not at all reserved for Druidry, but there is a sense of, I personally view my academic practice as an engagement with ancestral reverence, because I'm trying to understand, a society that's existed, for my ancestors so long ago, and that the cultural impact it had. And it's really an understanding of ancestral culture rather than personal ancestry. So it's about me saying that, I'm Welsh and trying to understand the sort of the sum of, our sort of the nation and people who lived before, not my own personal ancestors. And in parts of that, it can be difficult to do that. Wales is, like Ireland and like Scotland, is a nation that has been shaped by oppression and English colonialism for us, since countries and other ethnicities. And it can be hard to reconcile that, and it can be hard to say, well, how do I practice ancestor reverence, when I am aware of things that culturally people from Wales went and did to people such as the Native Americans or in India, or all this sort of thing. So it's difficult to do, and I think part of a lot of my stuff, a lot of my academic stuff, looks at the ideas of trauma, and one thing about that is sort of generational trauma and inheriting sort of burdens from previous generations. And I think that the only way in which we can sort of deal with that within ancestor reverence and so on is to acknowledge it, and not to sort of brush it under the carpet sort of thing and pretend like it never happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's to sort of critically engage with it. And a lot of people talk about this within the Welsh independence movement, is this idea of making mistakes in the past and fixing them with how we engage politically now. So, like this idea of Wales as a sanctuary, as a place that is welcoming to people seeking asylum, to anyone who wants to come to Wales, to live in Wales and to work here, to welcome them. And I think that is an aspect of it, and how we can heal those previous wounds from that our nation has inflicted upon other people. Because as much as we were oppressed as well, we also carried that oppression into other places, and you can't shy away from it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and it can be tough, and I really don't have I just don't have any answers for it, apart from to say that we need to recognise it and speak about it, and to try to work to certainly not make those mistakes again, but to actively improve.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
So has learning about your ancestors and the people from that land impacted your sense of belonging, identity, or spirituality? It sounds like it has kind of been the basis of your life path.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. So we have this idea within Wales, obviously not exclusive to Wales, this idea of Celtic, which is difficult to sort of translate into English. It's sort of like a longing for home, but it's more than that. It's this deep cultural longing for Wales and the culture of Wales. And I lived in London for 5 years, and as I was coming close to the end of my time in London, I did my degree there, and then I lived there for a couple more years, and I was seeing a therapist for some other sort of issues I had, and I ended up talking about this idea of Wales, and I sort of said, well, I have this feeling that when I get to Wales, when I find it, because I knew I was moving and so on, that I'm going home in this really true sense. And she was sort of, obviously, rightly a little bit like, well, perhaps don't be too hopeful, don't put everything into going back to this one place. But I came back, and honestly, I do feel like I've just come back to where I'm meant to be. And how much of that is, sort of, I can interpret as the God's influence of my own life, or just my own perception, and that sort of thing. It was, growing up, we were always told, had this very proud Welsh grandfather, and he would, just always tell us, you're more Welsh than anything else. And so I really wanted to, to come to Wales and to be part of the sort of the growing culture there. And since I've lived here, it's sort of a strange mix, I suppose, because one of the things I'm acutely aware of is everyone assumes, and because of Cardiff as well, we have lots of people who have moved to either to study, like me, or to work or whatever, and so they hear my accent, and they just assume that I'm English, rightly so, because I have a very English accent, and it's this very weird mix for me of I feel kind of guilt and shame for having this accent that has so long been an accent of oppression within Wales, and also the fact that I can't speak Welsh. I'm trying to learn some Welsh, and I speak a tiny bit of it, this shame that a lot of people have talked about, and that previous generations have really felt. In that my granddad, he died a couple of years ago, and his biggest it's a year and a half ago, and one of the things that he constantly tried to do later in life but couldn't was learn Welsh. And I know that for him it was such a source of pain that he died not being able to speak this language that was so intensely personal to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's very personal as well as, sort of academic stuff. But I think that has helped me. I think that, particularly if you're passionate about something, as I am with my thesis, you sort of need that personal drive. You need to have that connection in some way. It's got to mean something personal to you. So all of it is this sort of part of this journey into trying to become, it is about identity and about belonging and so on. And it's certainly not going to end when my MA is done, because I've got so
right.
So much more to do in terms of both understanding, building up my practice, building up my language skills, and one of the things that I certainly want to do is when I have children is to, which I'm hoping fairly soon, is to be able to send them to a Welsh medium school. And I was just discussed it with my boyfriend and so on. Is that in Wales you have English medium schools, you have Welsh medium schools, and you also have mixed. And I really want them to go to a Welsh medium school because I want them. Welsh medium school, you speak English fluently as well, but I really want them to have that experience and to be able to gain something that I was not given access to. And so I think it's all sort of part of that, and that generational healing and all that sort of thing. I mean, I've got a brother who I don't think he lives in Aberystwyth, which is on the coast further north in Wales, and I don't think he feels that same sense that I do, that sort of that striving for a belonging to Wales, even though I think he does identify as Welsh, and his girlfriend's Welsh, and she speaks fluent Welsh, and so I think it's, but my mum feels that she is Welsh, and just simple things like engaging with Welsh culture. Like we went to last year in sort of November, I think we went to a rugby match between Wales and Scotland, and we managed to get tickets to it because my boyfriend's cousin is physio for Welsh rugby, and we were there in the stadium, surrounded by people who sport in Wales and sport in Scotland as well, and just standing in that stadium and singing the Welsh national anthem. There's no other feeling. And the Welsh national anthem is amazing. It's this incredible piece of music that is so rousing, and you're there and you're sat watching your national team. And Wales is, rugby in Wales is almost like a religion in itself, and we always had to watch it. We always had to support Wales in the rugby when I was growing up and so on. But being able to see it live, it was just an incredible experience of feeling like that you belong to something much larger than yourself. I don't think obviously that plays into people's concepts of religion and belief and all that sort of stuff. So it was, a very interesting experience. And my mum's like, you need to get more tickets, you need to go again. And it was amazing. Yeah.
So you said a lot of things that I can identify with, and I think I don't know if you're mainstream and if you're of the dominant culture, I don't know if that would connect, but it definitely connected with me. So people do migrate and cultures are conquered. There are this history in the world of colonialism, and traditions mix and become something else. And with that in mind, how would you define cultural appropriation when it comes to spiritual practice? So where do you draw the line, or maybe what do you think people should keep in mind about that?
Well, I think it's very difficult to. I think that you're absolutely right that we've had processes of appropriation and traditions changing and so on for such a very long time. I mean, we went to go and see. We went to Bath to see springs at Bath, which were a holy site.
Mm-hmm.
They were. It was where people worshipped goddess Sulis, and when the Romans came, they changed it to Sulis Minerva. And one of the biggest complaints I had, my boyfriend had to listen to all of my rantings about Celtic mythology, about Iron Age stuff, and so on. And I'm sure he's really sick of me going, there isn't enough Iron Age stuff in this liturgy. And so really, and obviously the Celtic peoples came from what is now sort of like Spain and other places in Europe, and they came and they conquered other people who lived in Britain. So yeah, it's difficult to do, and I think that the issue with the term cultural appropriation is obviously it's mostly used pejoratively and correctly, I think, in terms of a dominant culture pretty much stealing other aspects of a less dominant culture or a conquered culture. But it's not inherently, cultural appropriation isn't inherently negative. It can just be, a different culture interpreting something from another culture. I think the issue is, when is it inappropriate and things like that, is that when there is no engagement with the culture you're taking something from or that you're inspired by. So if you're just taking it and you've got no real understanding of historically where it comes from, you've got no understanding of what it might mean in the present day, for example, then I think it's problematic. The issue is that I see sometimes is that, I have my own set of beliefs, and I'm sure people will disagree with them, and of course that they have every right to. And people can believe what they want to believe. But the issue is that when you just take things out of context and you get things wrong as well. I saw a post that's coming up for Lama, which is the Anglo-Saxon interpretation of Lunasa or Gwidaust, which that's fine. But it was sort of about how to make Lama bread, which is an Anglo-Saxon tradition and was likely also a tradition before that. Lunasa, fine. But it was to do with painting symbols on, and one of the symbols is the triquetra, and this is obviously a very important symbol within Druidry, within Celticism, and the truth is we're not exactly certain what it meant to ancient people, but it was just being, in this post it was just like, oh, this is a rune. First of all, it's not a rune. Like, there are no runes until the Vikings turn up in Wales. So it's a rune that means prosperity. We don't really know what it means, but pretty certain it doesn't mean that. And my issue is, the triquetra is about three things. The whole stuff of Druidry is about the concept of three. It's about one interpretation could be earth, sea, and sky. Sorry. Or it could be life, death, rebirth. It could, so it's it could be all these sort of different things and many things at the same time. But to be very prescriptive about it and to just blatantly make things up is wrong to me, and that's what angers me. And I think angers, people I don't think this is exclusively done to people studying Druidry and things like that. I don't think it is at all. I think that we have really important questions about using things, particularly like white sage is a big thing that a lot of pagans will do, and a lot of white pagans will do, and I certainly still never use it in my practice, because white sage is not native to Britain, so my ancestors certainly would never have used it. But it's also, apart from any of that, it is an incredibly important aspect of Native American religion, and Native American people have written about this, and it's certainly not my place to talk opinions are on it, but my issue is that there's this idea that, within Wiccanism, there is the phrase, this idea that that you do no harm, but otherwise you can do what you want, which is, that's a good concept. Yeah, I don't have any problems with that. But harm is more than just wishing ill intent on people. You can do harm by doing things like by spreading misinformation, or by taking things that aren't yours, and in the process harming other beliefs that have been traditionally oppressed by your ethnicity or your dominant culture. And to use those things, and particularly to use those things for no other thing than self-empowerment, I think is incredibly wrong. Because something like Druidry, they were a priestly class, but their role was to really oversee the care of their community. And so that's a very important aspect of Druidry, is that you should be engaged with your community, and that you should be engaged in, however you want to do that, charity, going and helping people out, whatever you want to do. And of course that's very important to many people engaged with paganism or otherwise. But for me, therefore, rituals, there's really no concept of the individual before the Enlightenment, not in the way that we would understand it. So you are defined by your clan or the settlement you live in, things like that. So you aren't doing rituals to make yourself rich or to find new love and things like that. And people can do whatever they want within sort of folkloric magic or whatever they want to do. Fine, but I find it particularly egregious when people take customs that were used to help protect things like, to protect areas of life, to protect ways of life, and to use it for your own self-empowerment. I think, and it's feeding a lot into a capitalist notion and a capitalist sort of sense of entitlement, and it's problematic, and I don't have really any answers about it necessarily, apart from do your research. Pretty much it. I think as long as you're engaging and you are respectful and you just show a bit of awareness, then that's fine. And I don't want to sit here and say what is right or wrong for people to do, and that for me to say what you can find meaning from and what you can't. But I think you can't divorce your spirituality and your intentions, as good as they may be, from the effect they can have on the world and from other people. So I think you just have to be very aware of it, and it's something I try to do as well, and I probably get things wrong as well. So it's a constant process, and I recognise that. And
very good points. Well said. So what do you think about mixing gods and elements? I saw an eclectic approach to spirituality. So a little African, a little Native American, a little Celtic, Egyptian, whatever. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts would be, I certainly don't do it, obviously. It's like with anything, if you personally gain a lot from it, and you gain happiness from it, or whatever you want to use fulfillment, then I'm sort of cautious of saying, you can't use stuff. But all I can say is that the gods that I revere and that I try to keep on the good side of, I don't think appreciate being just lumped in with a load of other gods. And also, it's sort of, I don't know how you really do it. It's hard enough for me to understand the gods of my own pantheon, and I don't know all of the ancient Iron Age gods, and I'm constantly finding new stuff, new sources, and how do I integrate this? It's kind of from Gaul, so is it valid in Britain? And it's very complex. So I certainly think you can do it. My issue is that you can sometimes be too simplistic, I think. You can just say, so a big thing is everyone says Aliamrod or Alamrod is a moon goddess. The Irish don't have a moon goddess. They just don't. It's not a thing. So Aliamrod means silver wheel. She's a character within the fourth branch of the Mabinogion, and she's more of a figure of, sometimes she's interpreted as a love goddess. I would say she's more sort of sexual empowerment. She could also be, she could be viewed in modern times as a goddess of abortion, which is quite interesting. But if we basically categorise her as she is a love goddess, so therefore she is, I don't know, you could use her alongside Aphrodite, for example, from the Greek pantheon. And I would add here that what I know of Aphrodite is extremely basic. So, but I don't think, from what I know of Aphrodite, that Ariane Rod is really like her at all. And so if you're trying to say that they're, and people can get very involved in archetypes. So they're like, oh, there's a mother goddess, and there's the horned god, and, this idea. And you just cannot do that. If you try and reduce it to that simplistic a formula, it doesn't work. It does not hold up. You've got too many variations. So within the Celtic pantheon, we have Knonos, who sometimes thought of as the horned god, who is a god that is seen throughout Indo-European sort of culture, but I sort of revere him as Gwyn ab Nuth, who's a character in the Mabinogion, but is also very important within Welsh traditional Welsh folklore, and seems to be better representative of Knonos. So I'm already having to blend stuff already, and it's just very difficult, and you can't reduce them to, for example, Rhiannon is sometimes viewed as a mother goddess. She's sometimes seen as similar to a character called Modron, who seems to be based on the goddess Don, or Mona, which is what Anglesey is named after, Unismon. And she's connected to Danu in the Irish mythology. And how do I reconcile the Irish cognates with with Welsh gods and all this sort of stuff? So it's incredibly complex. So if you want to try and make it even more complex, then of course you can. And I think that's pretty brave, to be honest with you. But I also just think, I have obviously, probably to some people, quite extreme views in terms of what I would accept to revere it, sort of thing, in that, Celtic Reconstructionism is often accused of being kind of exclusionist, in that it's very, very academic. And all I can say is that I have to have that approach for it to be meaningful for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand the objections to it, but I also feel, our perspective is that if you're not engaging it in this sort of way, that in a sense you're just making stuff up, which finding things that are personally fulfilling to you is of course important, but for me, I'm just like, I don't want to get on the wrong side of my gods, and particularly if you're going to start messing around with stuff like Lama and Nasa. Lug is, or Llew Llawgoles, his name means, so Llew Llawgoles means Llew of skillful hand, and sometimes he's thought to be connected with light, but actually my supervisor, who's done a lot of work on this, has pretty well refuted that. This stem of Lug is really to do with oaths. So he's a god of oaths and he's a god of spear casting, and he is pretty vengeful in the material. So I would not be messing around on doing whatever you want on Lunasa. I just gave an offering to Cleo, and I was like, please respect this, and it's some gods I feel that are more personable, I suppose. If you can approach in times where you need support and things like that, I wouldn't classify Cleo as one of those gods. He's definitely he's a warrior figure. He's very skilled at spear throwing, so I just, I respect him and I back away. But, that's my interpretation. Some people don't like to sing to the gods like that, and fair enough, but, we used to the Druids used to sacrifice people to the gods, so, I don't do that, so I should add. Obviously, some forms of Reconstructionism you can't do, and that's what they're like. Obviously, don't sacrifice people.
Well, thank you, Catherine. All of this has been super, super interesting. I do appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
There you have it. Another perspective on spirituality. We support all views and want to give you ideas on how to shape your own practice. So I hope this was helpful for you. And if you want to deepen your practice of animism and want a mentor, you can check out pansociety.org, where Sherry and I are offering mentoring. You can post your questions on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the podcast, or email me at laura@pansociety.net. We love your feedback and love hearing from you. So I'd like to close by sending gratitude to Katherine Moore, to the elements, our loving, helping ancestors, and I thank you all for joining us for this edition of the Modern Animism radio program. Again, don't forget to donate, as we do need your financial and emotional support, and you can donate on our website at pansociety.net. Thanks for tuning in. This is Laura Giles. I'll see you next week.